Yeah, I like to start this presentation with this quotation from James Baldwin: "An identity would seem to be arrived at by the way in which a person faces and uses his experiences." And that's really what this research study is about. It's truly about the experiences and identity development of students of color at independent schools. And those experiences are going to drive how we react, or in particular, these students react to their predominantly white independent school spaces. So with that, I want to take you along this research journey, which, starting from the bottom, looks at experiences of students of color in general, and then looks at the connection between the different factors, really hoping to first identify the factors that drive student of color experiences, understanding those connections between those, and then to do some quantitative investigation as to show the statistical connections between these items. And then, if there's time, we'll go into a real deep statistical dive on regression and predictability, and how some of these factors, in particular racial coping, can reduce some of the stressors that students experience at their schools. I will warn you in advance. I will throw a lot at you. Don't be shy as we go through. Please put your questions in the chat, and we can clarify as we go. Just as
Jackson, can I interrupt you for 1
Sure.
second and remind folks what you and I talked about, which is that we're going to end this officially right at 4 o'clock.
Yep,
Sorry,
thank you.
at 3 o'clock. It's a 1 hour. It's a 1 hour seminar. But Jackson has agreed to stay behind to chat with people and to answer further questions and dig a little deeper if some of you want to stay beyond 3 o'clock.
Sure. Excellent. Thank you, Barbara. So with that, I'll kind of plow through some of the overview stuff so we can get into the data in a moment. The study is comprised of 525 students who attended 74 different independent schools in 8 states. The vast majority of the students in schools were in New York State, in particular New York City. In terms of the gender breakdown, gender and racial breakdowns, this is a breakdown of the population based on self-identified gender and racial categories. It was interesting to me that in trying to be as inclusive as possible in allowing students to self-identify in multiple racial categories, that students who identified as both African American and Latinx, or Afro-Latinx, if you will, their responses were more similar to students who identified as just African American than their Latinx peers. So this is something to think about as you consider supporting the different students in your school. Just a reminder that these experiences are nuanced, and that we should try to take that into account as we go. All of the students in the study were prep students. About 16% of them were in middle school, 50% of them were in upper school, and I had students who were up to their second year of undergraduate school, because I wanted to kind of confine the responses to recent independent school experiences.
Jackson,
Sure.
A quick question, that this is an important one that I'm not sure I asked you, and that
Sure.
is, will you make the PowerPoint available? If you say no, that's fine. It's just that way people will take notes.
Absolutely, I will make a version of the PowerPoint available.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. As we go, I wanted to just highlight a couple of conceptual frames that I think are important to understanding the lens through which I use to enter into the study. The first is critical race theory in education, and that's the notion that systems of oppression are interwoven into our education infrastructure, and we should keep that in mind as we look at our traditions and policies and practices in independent schools. PVEST, or phenomenological variant ecological systems theory, that's phenomenological variant ecological systems theory is an expansion on Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. And that's at first the notion that we're all products of our environment. That's the Bronfenbrenner piece, but Margaret Spencer takes it a step further in the sense that even though we're products of our own environment, we're all going to experience the same thing differently based on the experiences that we bring. So as an example, we're all experiencing this talk, but based on our racial socialization and what we bring to the table, what we've learned along the way, we're going to experience this talk and this seminar slightly differently. And that's something to consider as we think about our students as they walk through our halls. Racial socialization is, what we learn from usually our family members and friends about race. In longer talks, I go into the story of my own racial socialization, where the short version of it is my great-grandfather was born into slavery. My grandmother, who was an elementary school teacher, was told that by white parents that they didn't want her to teach their children until they saw her test scores, and so on and so forth, right? These are things that I brought with me into my independent school, because I too am an independent school student. And I also ask you to consider, what is your racial socialization as you journey through not only your own work, but your personal life. For those of you who have to hop right away and go on to other meetings and things, this is my session surfer slide. The things that I want you to remember and take away from this talk are, in general, that the experiences are not doom and gloom. Even though the students in this study may be critical of their schools, they do have an overarching positive experience, and I think it's important to realize of their experiences. Microaggressions are, as we'll see in a moment, are more stressful and create this slow drain on students over time, is something to consider as we think about the the conversations around race and racial literacy training we're doing in middle school, lower school, and middle school. School climate factors, are a big driver, and I have the statistics to prove it. Girls of color report a more challenging time than boys of color, almost across all factors. And what I often say is that as someone who worked in independent schools for a number of years, I always assumed, I'm guilty of assuming, that the girls were okay because in general their grades were better, right? But when you remove the academic part of this, we see a different story. And it's also interesting to note that in the qualitative data, the boys also recognize the more challenging time that their girl peers were having. I talked about school climate factors moving the needle. Racial literacy also moves the needle as well, and we'll see that how that bears out statistically in a moment. And ultimately, the students in the study want to see engagement from their peers and their faculty in conversations around race and difference. As we go, things I want you to consider again, how does this data apply to your school context? What does this data agree or disagree with what you think is going on in your school? I see these data as a grade from a group of students to us as school leaders on the DEI policy and practice, or curriculum and practice that's happening in the school. And as we look into the numbers that are on scales of 1 to 5 or 1 to 4, what is the value of a grade, right? A 4 out of 5 on my US history quiz would be a B-, right? But a 4 out of 5 in baseball, you're a multimillionaire Hall of Famer, right? So just things to think about. These are numbers, but you also have to put your own interpretation onto them. And finally, as we dive in, I also want you to consider how might these data look for students who don't receive the support that Prep provides, and I'll walk through that briefly in a moment. And also, what does this, how would this study look if we use the same survey or interview instruments with white students? And something that I've been thinking about researching of late is how might this look for parents as they interact with schools as well. So that's kind of the future implications for it. Barbara, are there any questions thus far? Or are we good to go?
The questions really were about, will the slide deck be shared, and
Sure.
are we recording this and sharing it? And the answer to those is yes.
Great, great. I apologize in advance to any Miami Dolphins fans, but this is less about the data, but more about what the data leads me to believe. And I think the data makes the case for racial literacy training. And I use the example of the 0-7 at the time Miami Dolphins because one of my favorite sports columnists, Bomani Jones, talked about the idea that he felt the coaching staff of the Miami Dolphins were putting their players in harm's way because of reckless or lackadaisical coaching. Right? And when I think about what that means in a school context, if we're not having conversations about race and difference and building racial literacy skills for all of our students, I think we're putting our students in the institutions in jeopardy, right? We're putting a student who receives a micro or a macroaggression in jeopardy of not learning how to react or respond to that moment, and doing something that may get them in trouble or suspended or expelled, and if we don't have the conversation with the student who may deliver, a word that they haven't fully thought through, are we putting them in jeopardy of later on saying something silly? I'm a Black guy from Brooklyn. How I got into NASCAR, I don't know. I love NASCAR, but there was an incident just this week where a NASCAR driver used the N-word, and he said he didn't really understand the implications of it, but now he's fired. He's lost all of his sponsors. And I wonder what would happen if someone would have given him racial literacy training earlier on. How do we, and I also think this training, for those of us who deal in administration, may save us from the lawsuit, right? On the other side of our slide, I have Dr. Howard Stevenson, who was my dissertation chair, and he talks about teaching racial literacy through protection, affection, connection, and correction. And the protection piece is really important to me. I think racial literacy provides a measure of protection that allows us to have these difficult conversations, to avoid putting our proverbial foot in our mouths, and allows us to connect people in a way that's meaningful. And the correction piece, to me, is just good education. We correct students about language all the time in the hallways. We correct students about dress code. We correct our students' papers. We can make the corrections through connection in a really meaningful way that benefits the whole school community. So that's my general stance on racial literacy. And you'll also note that a number of the theories I'm using today were developed by Dr. Stevenson as well. Data time. The grades are in. Let's see where we're going. I want to situate the data. I know I'm doing a lot of kind of prefacing, but it's important to situate the data and understand that the students in this population, or the participant group, are all prep students, and they receive 14 months of academic and social emotional training before they hit their school campuses. They also receive a supplemental advisor who will visit with them multiple times throughout the year and have conversations around academic support, but also a lot of socially and emotionally supportive questions, and that often revolve around race and helping students process what they're experiencing. So when I ask the question, what does this look like? What does these data look like for students who are not prep students? I don't know what the answer is, but it's important to know that this participant group has, or received prior to their independent school entry and during their journey a tremendous amount of support. Right? And that looks like, to go through this quickly, during the 14-month program, an advisory, near-peer advisory system, a small group class that's taught by a guidance counselor, where we talk about identity and what it means to be one of few and understanding microaggressions. Identity is woven into our literature courses. Invictus talks about decision making. PIMIS, Problems and Issues in Modern American Society, looks about income and education inequality in the context of America. And we do some, at the end of the summer, before students are placed into their schools, we do a film study where the protagonist has to change worlds and has an experience that will mirror a lot of what our preferred prep students will have when they hit their schools. Questions so far, Barbara? Great. So, as we go through here, I want you to understand kind of the sequence as I see it. I think you have the school racial climate that may or may not cause racial stress. Racial literacy will impact how students are understanding their school climate and the stress that's impacting them, and it also includes how they will respond and manage that stress. Your DEI curriculum and practice is, again, a school climate factor, which will have an influence on sense of belonging. Another way to look at this, and I'm sorry, not sorry for the busy slide, but it's really, the progression is the context influences the stress, which will be mitigated by coping strategies, which will then result in outcomes. So those outcomes are school trust or affection or belonging or school membership. The scale is, the different instruments I use to measure these things, and the purpose slide just kind of talks about what we're looking at and how we are interpreting the data. And when we think about context, I see that as something that schools can control. The racial stress is what students of color experience, but I also want to be careful to mention that I don't think that racial stress is the sole domain of students or people of color. I think that all of us experience racial stress in some way. Racial literacy and coping is what we can control internally, and then then you have the outcomes that flow through. All right, now it's time for the data. So this first slide kind of illustrates the arc that is very much a through line in the data set. We have a student who was a leader in her community who talked about this conflicted sense of belonging and wishing her students, her peers, had the vocabulary and the desire to speak up about race. She also talks about the emotional burden of having to be a student and a teacher, a diversity practitioner at the same time, in particular at a school that was rigorous, that's asking her to do really well. So we go from the red to the gray, where we see the emotional toll, right? We see a student, this happens to be a boarding school student, talking about not wanting to go to class or engage in the work, to a point where she eventually has enough by senior year, says, I'm not doing the diversity work, I'm not going to argue with people, and that her taking a moment to breathe actually lifted that weight off of her, and she could just be a student, and she was great, right? So when I look at this looks like the talented student who doesn't run for student government. This looks like the student who suddenly transfers out, right? Even though they're doing well academically. So, I hope that this data helps us to create school communities where students don't feel that burden as they go. But the saving grace at the end is that the student actually sees the the impact of her work and feels energized to and a connection to her community that she really didn't realize that she had. And I think the other punchline to pull from the slide is that student activism, racial debating, is a stressful construct that has implications for the rest of the student experience. I'm gonna, so that just kind of frames the through line, but we're gonna go a little bit deeper into what this looks like in the individual factors. You're going to see some slides that are admittedly busy. What you'll see is day schools in some slides represented by the clocks, boarding schools represented by the dorms, and then I wanted us to have a visual representation of the standard deviation, which are represented by these stars, because it's also instructive to understand that even within an average or a mean, there's a good deal of variance. When we look at, excuse me, school climate factors, I think it's important to understand that these are perceptions, and that I'm not suggesting that DEI work isn't happening. I am suggesting that it may or may not land the way we would like. Oftentimes I begin this presentation and I pulled it for time. I often ask people, what do you expect your school's commitment to diversity to be through the eyes of a student? So if we look at the far right, at committed and open to diversity efforts, or CODE, that Dr. Stevenson and I like to use, our students are saying in this particular group are saying that they think they're rating their school at 2.4 out of 5 as being committed to diversity. I checked. I was actually surprised by that number. I thought it would be higher. That scale measures things like, I know where my school's diversity statement is. I understand my diversity statement, my school's diversity statement. My school does what it says it's going to do related to diversity, and people of diverse backgrounds, racial backgrounds, hold positions of authority. Going back to the far left, conflictual racial school climate is a measure of how often microaggressions are witnessed, experienced, either personally or students hearing about them. It also is a measure of how often large negative racial moments happen. Anti-bias school climate is a measure of how often a school attends to bias, either student to student or faculty to student. Inclusive school racial climate is a measure of how often conversations about race are happening either student to student, in the classroom, or with the head of school, or with administrators. And racial activism is a measure of the frequency in which students have to speak up about issues of race and difference. And stereotype awareness is a frequency measure of how often students are witnessing or hearing about racial stereotypes in the community. I didn't want to focus on the doom and gloom. I wanted to understand what students in this population wanted to see from their communities to improve. So again, they're asking for, similar to the first student we looked at, they're asking for their white peers and faculty to engage in the conversation, right? They also find it helpful when teachers and faculty are open to talk about these things, right? And create space for students to express their full identity. So mirroring kind of the progression that I set forth before, we go from school climate factors to stress factors. I didn't want to measure racial stress in a vacuum. I wanted to see how racial stress matched up against other things and whether I could tease out different types of racial stress. So the type way of racial activism or racial debating stress is the stressfulness of having a conversation, debating someone about a stereotype. Diversity activity stress would be the stressfulness of sitting in the auditorium and hearing me give this presentation. Microaggression stress, witnessing microaggression stress, and it speaks for itself. Social stress is related to making friends and extracurricular activities, and academic stress is a measure of the stressfulness of just the general academic classes. So that's math, modern language, English language arts, and social studies and things like that. Barbara, did I see a question pop into the feed?
I'm sorry, I was muted. Actually, I'm going to unmute Ronald. Ronald
Sure.
Taylor, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. Jackson, thank you for your presentation so far. My question, if you answer it later, feel free to pause me until later.
Sure.
But I'm just curious, would you say that the intersection of culturally responsive and reality-based programming at Prep led to more positive experiences in independent schools based on the research that you had access to, since you had an outside agent that was influencing students' engagement in the schools?
That's my speculation. That's my guess, right? You know, I didn't get a chance to study other students who were not from Prep for Prep, but when I think about the amount of vocabulary around diversity, equity, and inclusion that our students come to their schools with, they're coming with an awareness and a set of strategies that I don't think other students have. So my guess, again, my guess is that these data in some areas might be more positive, or you know, the opposite could be true. With more awareness, right? You see more things, and you may be inclined to hold people to account more, and we can talk about that a little bit more as we go.
Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
And then Yadwa had a question.
Oh,
Yep. I've unmuted you.
Okay. You know, it was a few slides back, so I guess overall, I wanted to understand whether you were talking about an example with a student in the school who felt the burden of the communicating the example. It seemed like she was the teacher, I guess.
Right.
This was a few slides back. And I guess my question was, what is the role of curriculum? What is the role of a diversity director if a school, if every school has that person? Like, she's filling the gaps. What is failing? That she's on the spot, but is there no one supporting her at all? Is she, I just wanted to know, are there layers of support that exist that are ineffective, or are there no layers of support at all?
I mean, that's an interesting question, and I think that's the fundamental question for this work. I think there's a tension between, you know, when you rely on students to give you the information, that may feel burdensome. But I think what students are saying is that the students in this group are saying that they don't want to be the only person or the only people with the vocabulary to have conversations, right? They want their faculty members to model the discomfort of having an uncomfortable conversation, so that their peers will jump in, right? They want their peers to be able to understand what a microaggression is, and you know, the context behind the N-word and so on and so forth. So again, it's not that the work isn't happening. There are particular places where there are gaps, to use your word, and I think that's where the frustration lies. And that also, you know, I think we also have to be careful, is that, you know, schools are in different places on this continuum. and maybe, you know, I think the answers will come to light more as we go through.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Barbara, I'm gonna move us forward a little bit. So what does that stress look like, right? You know, this student was actually not in my study, but I did meet with a group of students from a BSU at a school on the East Coast, and the student talks about, the African American male, what it looks like for him to get ready for school every day, right? And as he was talking about getting dressed, and he was, you know, his body language changed. I could see his affect changed as he went, and you know, I often get the question, well, is it just race or is it socioeconomic? This is a full pay lifer, right? Who talked about how no matter how much money he has, he still deals with a certain level of discomfort, particularly related to microaggressions. And what I found in the data was that the stressfulness around microaggressions increased as students got older, right? And the way the students described it was that in 7th grade, perhaps they didn't care or they didn't know, right? In 8th grade, it hurts a little bit, but they're willing to give it a pass. By junior and senior year, it's hurtful, and it really impacts how students are experiencing and how they feel about their schools. So we've gone from climate factors to stress. Now we're into racial coping and the strategies people use to deal in their community. So going from left to right, you know, stereotype awareness is a measure of how well people understand or able to read you know, stereotypes in the things that they themselves say, what their peers say, and what people in the community are saying. Racial stress management is their ability to manage the stress of a stressful moment. I'll talk more about that soon. And external resolution is the ability to resolve a situation in a way that's healthy to you, not necessarily to the community, but that's what's healthy to you. So what that looks like is, if I'm called the N-word on the street as I'm getting into my car, I have two choices. I can get in my car and drive with road rage, or I can employ a racial coping strategy. And the coping strategy I tend to use is Dr. Howard Stevenson's CLCBE method. That's CLCBE, calculate, locate, communicate, breathe, and exhale, right? I've identified the issue, right? And I'm working through my stress management, and so I will calculate how upset I am. I will locate where I feel it in my body. Typically, I feel that stress all over my body, and I need to move around. Then I will communicate either through self-talk or to a peer or my brother or something like that. And then I will breathe and exhale and bring my stress level from a 10 to a 5 so I can drive without road rage. In a school context, that might look like a student being able to process the microaggression or macroaggression and get from a 10 down to a 5, or maybe an 8 down to a 3, so they can go and take their math quiz, right? The external resolution may look like me having a conversation with my brother. It may look like asking for help from the head of school. It may look like me going off, right? It's something that helps me resolve the situation in something in a way that's helpful to me, right? Next to the right is racial encounter influence, right? That's a measure of how confident I am my response is going to work, right? If you're not confident that your response is going to work, you may choose something different, or you may choose to avoid the situation. So if I think about going from, now that I have Dr. Stevenson's CLCBE, that's my go-to method. My other go-to method is help me understand, right? when I encounter foolishness, I say, help me understand. And that gives me a moment to think and breathe. It puts it on the other person for a moment, and then I can move forward and think of a strategy that might work. Or I might avoid it if we go far right. Racial encounter avoidance is a strategy, but it's not necessarily a very healthy strategy. That looks like 14-year-old Jackson skipping the dining hall on a day that may make him look or feel like he's part of a stereotype. I apologize in advance for the crass example, but that looks like Jackson skipping lunch on fried chicken and watermelon day because he doesn't want to be the stereotype of the Black man eating fried chicken and watermelon. And what does that look like? He's hungry for the rest of the day. Then he's upset that he skipped the lunchroom, thinking that's stupid, and that lots of people like fried chicken and watermelon, and people aren't even thinking about that. So avoidance gets us into a place where we end up carrying more energy. Or it may look like not intervening when you hear or saying something when you hear when you hear a microaggression. Why do we avoid things, right? Is that because students feel powerless? Either they don't have the strategy, or the school climate is such that students don't feel like they have someone to go to, or they don't believe that their teachers will understand what they're going through. I often say that 14-year-old Jackson would give his white peers and faculty a greater benefit of the doubt if he knew that they were doing racial literacy training, right? How many of you, it's tough now because we're locked in our apartments, but how many of you are going to tell your students that you sat through, Jackson Collins talking for an hour, right? Knowing that has a knock-on effect. Question so far? And I realize I need to speed this up. We talked about racial coping strategies, and what I would like is that moving from the far right, I would like to get this avoidance number down, and I would like to have the encounter and stress management scales move up. Right? These are measures of how well students feel as though they know how to do these things, or how often they're doing these things. Right? So avoidance looks like swallowing your anger in the moment, in the midst of a racial encounter. This is an illustration of how students are describing that, and I think that while schools can move the needle on the school climate, I think that schools can also move the needle on racial literacy, right? Although we're saying that students can control them, but we can teach racial literacy. And when I look at this quotation, it leads me to believe that prep could possibly do more, but I also think that schools can do more in building up racial literacy strategies for students. Belonging is something that we often talk about in schools. I use the psychological sense of school membership scale by Carol Goodnow to measure sense of belonging. And if we start at the bottom, the mean score is 3.7 out of 5 for the full population. Moving up from the bottom, community belonging are subscale. So the top three, community belonging, teacher respect, and detachment and isolation are broken out from the total belonging score. And what we find is that community belonging relates more to interactions with students. So I feel like a real part of this community. It's easy for me to make friends. Teacher respect looks like questions related to, I have an adult in the community that I can reach out to if I need help. It looks like teachers notice when I do good work, and then the detachment/isolation scale are questions or statements like, I feel very different from the people in my community. I wish I went to a different school. I don't feel like I belong here. so, what does that look like? It looks, well, moving a little quickly, I think it's the other thing that's interesting to think about is, although we're at 3.7 out of 5, we have students who are just above 2.5 and students who are just below 5. So we have students who feel, really isolated or really attached to their schools, again, illustrating some of the nuance in the experiences that students are having. This is a student talking about like their connection. Students talked about how they know what it's like to be X type of student, but they didn't necessarily feel a deep connection with their school community, which I think has implications for fundraising down the road, whether alumni will send their children to the school later on, and also how much students are going to engage in the activities and the goings on in the school. Again, things that make students feel connected. Teachers having the willingness to have these conversations. I spoke about this before, and really teachers leading the way. And when we look at the belonging scale, what you'll see is that teachers are leading the chart. So that, to me, that's evidence that DEI work from the adult perspective is happening. But when we think about the difference between teachers and students, and we also overlay that onto the microaggression scale, the microaggressions are happening in general, or coming in general from students. So the challenge is, how do we coach up the students in the community to be better stewards of their peers? Barbara, do we have questions? I know we're running short.
Samika actually had a related question to what you're talking about. Samika, I just, I think, unmuted you.
No problem. Thank you, Barbara. Hi, Jackson. Really thinking, is what you're sharing right now a reflection of the work that diversity and equity practitioners are doing, or the work that is happening institutionally? I think that sometimes there's misunderstanding about who's responsible for trying to create that sense of belonging, or reversing kind of the racial stress that exists in the school. So just wanting some clarity on that. Thank you.
I think it's important to think about it in two ways. There's a DEI curriculum and what the practitioners are doing, and how that is being implemented and lived throughout the community. So I see this data as a grade to the community as to how this stuff is actually playing out, right? So I like to be clear that the DEI work is happening, right? I just don't know. I think there are some challenges in how it's being received by students and lived, outside in the hallways, right? So that looks like, if we're waiting to upper school and a K-12 school to have these conversations, what has happened along the way, right? What learning could have happened in kindergarten or second grade or fourth grade or seventh grade that might shift this stuff. And it's challenging because each year, there's different entry points for students, and you're getting a new group of students who are in different places along their journey. So I'm not suggesting that the answers are easy, and I think this highlights some of the work that needs to be done, with students. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's my interpretation of the data, is that the work is happening, and the students talk about the qualitative data that the work is happening, but there's a certain level of stickiness that hasn't either been articulated or received that isn't perfect. And granted, and the other thing I will stipulate is that we are looking at adolescents, and I don't think it's reasonable to have a perfect score, but I think these things, I think these scores can be higher. All right. All right. Got 11 minutes. Sure, Barbara. Go ahead.
Caitlin had a related question too.
Sure.
Caitlin, I've unmuted you.
Hi.
About academic stress.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, Jackson. It was a question that was specific to one of the earlier slides. I was curious whether or not that variable of academic stress included questions around the choices that were made by departments with regard to the curriculum, like what books are chosen in English or how topics are approached in history, or were they general to how the students feel like they are able to handle the work generally?
Yeah, great question. That scale just asked about the general stressfulness of subjects like math, history, science, and modern language. What I will say is that students did talk about in some of my interviews and focus groups about the choices of books and literature, and why does the narrative about an African American always have to be Frederick Douglass, or something to that effect. So the students are talking about those choices. I think the other thing to note is that on that academic stress scale is that prep for prep students generally do well in school, right? So that's maybe skewed by, again, the participant population. All right. I'm going to move us forward a little bit. Oh, there's a bag. I love the bag. I'm sorry, who just asked me that question? That was Caitlin? Am I forgetting the name?
Yes, it was Caitlin. Yeah.
Thank you. Great. I'm glad your bag popped up when you turned your video off, because on the right is my baby brother, my taller baby brother who played professional basketball overseas. And the story I say is that I love my brother, but every summer he would leave a bag in my small New York City apartment, and I would stub my toe all the time. And when I stubbed my toe, I would love my brother, and I would be challenged by my brother at the same time, right? That also holds true with how students express their emotional well-being and how they feel about their schools, right? The positive and negative affect schedule I use as a proxy for expressions of emotional well-being, and it subscribes to the notion that you can feel positive and negatively about a place at the same time, a place or a thing or a concept at the same time. So when you look at these scores going from the top to the bottom, positive affect are things like I feel excited or proud to be part of my school, fearful, it's questions like I feel fearful or anxious about being in school, and unfriendly affect are things like I feel anger or hatred or dislike towards my school. Again, being careful with averages. When you look at the stars, you see there's a broad range or an interesting range where students reside on these scales. And to the point, the question about the work related to, we're doing the DEI work, but sometimes it's not really sticking. It doesn't mean that the students still aren't having positive experiences at, in their schools. And I quote Baldwin again, I love America more than any other country, and exactly for this reason I insist the right to criticize it perpetually. And that's what the students in this study do. They love their schools and they criticize them because they want them to be better, right? I love my brother, and I talk about him because I want him to get his own place so he can stop using my apartment as a storage unit. I spoke earlier about girls reporting a more challenging time than boys in this study. You'll see that in the gender column, and this illustrates the different factors where that statistically significant difference is occurring. You'll also note that boardings in general are reporting a more challenging time than their day school peers across an even broader range of factors. What was also interesting to me is that there, at least in this population of students, there didn't appear to be much difference, at least on a statistically significant basis, between the different racial groups. And that may be a quirk of the racial demographics of prep for prep. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to be able to see the relationship between these things. I think what's interesting here, when you think about the belonging subscales across the top, so that's school belonging, teacher respect, and school detachment, when you look at the correlations, and these are, almost as strong as they could be, or I should say they are correlated at a very strong confidence level. Some of these are moderate to strong correlations. If you were to look at diversity activity stress, what this is telling us is that as teacher respect goes up, the stressfulness of diversity activities may go down. And it's important to say correlation is not causation, right? But statistically, there's enough of a relationship there to suggest that there's something working. The other interesting thing to note is the impact on respect and academic stress, which makes sense. I've also done some correlations that look at microaggression stress on school and academic stress, which are fascinating. So microaggression stress on social stress, increasing social stress makes sense to me, but it was interesting to see how academic stress was correlated to some of the school climate factors around race. And then lastly, and then I can open it up for questions. This slide really makes the case for racial literacy and racial coping strategies. And what we see here is in the pink and the green is that as students experience their highest levels of racial stress, the students who report moderate to high levels of racial coping are perceiving their school to be less threatening than students who report low levels of racial coping. So it's not that they aren't stressed about race, but that stress isn't putting students into racing mind syndrome or a threat zone where they can still operate, right? But it's fascinating to see that students who don't have these strategies are in the threat space, and those students tend to move into an area where they're going to avoid the conversation. They're not going to ask for help because they perceive their school as a threat. Another way of looking at this is the stressfulness of racial debating. The stressfulness of racial debating has an impact on how students feel that their school is conflictual. But in short, what's interesting here is that if you have racial coping strategies, that actually takes the students from a place where they're perceiving their schools as conflictual to a place where they feel more belonging. And we can talk about this slide more in the after party.